So in Matthew chapter 23, we've seen that Yeshua says the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They have this Mosaic authority. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. And here it really sounds like Yeshua is saying very clearly, you must obey the Pharisees. They sit in the seat of Moses. You must obey whatever they command you to do if you're going to be obedient to what Yeshua says. Well, we've already seen this doesn't really make sense. Matthew 15, Yeshua warns his disciples not to do according to the ways of the Pharisees. Their traditions of the elders transgress the Torah. However, in Matthew 23, he's saying obey whatever they tell you to do. If they tell you to put your right shoe on first in the morning, you better obey them because they have Mosaic authority. What's going on here? Well, the answer is here in the Hebrew. And if you can read this old Hebrew script, and you already know the answer. This is what it looks like transcribed into modern Hebrew print. And what Yeshua says there in Hebrew Matthew, chapter 23, verses 2 to 3, Yeshua says, Al kisei Moshe Yeshua pirushim v'chachamim, v'ata kol asher yomar lachem shimru v'asu, u'v'takanotehem u'ma'asehem al ta'asu, shehem omrim v'hem einam usim. So there you have it. There you see. It's very clear. This is what it would look like translated into English. There Yeshua says, the Pharisees and sages sit upon the seat of Moses, therefore all that he says to you, diligently do. But according to their reforms and their precedents, do not do, because they talk, but they do not do. Now that's a very subtle difference between what you saw in the Greek, a difference of one single word, or primarily one single word. In the Greek, it had said in Matthew, all that they say, you must obey all that they say, they being the Pharisees. In the Hebrew, he says you must obey all that he says, he being Moses. So the difference of this one single word fundamentally changes Yeshua's message. What he's saying now is, obey. If their claim to authority is that they sit in the seat of Moses, so do as Moses says. Obey Moses. They claim their authority as they're sitting in this ornate stone chair in the synagogue, they're teaching with supposed authority, sitting in the seat of Moses, so obey Moses. Do what Moses says. Now, how did this happen? How do we change from they say to he says? Well, this is what it looks like in Hebrew, in the Hebrew manuscripts. And you can see it's very similar. It's almost identical. The difference between he says and they say is the difference of one single letter, the Hebrew letter Vav. This one single letter, the addition of this one single letter changed Yeshua's original message, which was an instruction to his disciples to obey Moses, to an instruction to his disciples to obey the Pharisees. So it changed his message from something that made perfect sense, their claim to authorities that they sit in the seat of Moses, so do what Moses says, to this message which contradicts his own words in Matthew 15, which is obey the Pharisees. He goes on there, Yeshua, in Hebrew Matthew, and he says, according to their reforms and their precedents, do not do. And the word I've translated here as reforms in Hebrew is takanot. We've heard that word before, so let's all repeat that word. Takanot. So takanot are these man-made laws like the washing of the hands, and Yeshua's warning his disciples not to do according to their takanot. And I translated this before as enactments. A more precise dictionary definition of takanot is reforms that change biblical law. That's how the word is defined more precisely in the Jastrow Dictionary, which is a standard dictionary of early rabbinical Hebrew, late Second Temple Hebrew. Reforms that change biblical law. And the classic example of one of these man-made laws, these takanot, is the commandment to wash your hands of the rabbis before you eat bread. Well, now that we understand Matthew 23, and we see that Yeshua is not telling you to obey the Pharisees, he's telling you to obey Moses, we still have to go back at Matthew 15 and see what it says there in the Hebrew. If we started off with what was a contradiction in the Greek, we can't just look at the Hebrew of one passage and not the other. So now let's look at Matthew 15 in the Hebrew, and there we read, why do you also, Yeshua says to the Pharisees, why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? You made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. Can anyone guess what the Hebrew word behind tradition is? The word is takanot. So not only is there no contradiction in the Hebrew between Matthew 15 and Matthew 23, but in the Hebrew there's a consistent message throughout the entire book. There's this consistent string that runs through the book that Yeshua is warning his disciples not to follow the takanot of the Pharisees, these man-made laws of the Pharisees. If we go on in Matthew 15 in the Hebrew, we read in verse 9, remember how in the Greek it said teaching for doctrines the commandments of men? And I mentioned that was a paraphrase of Isaiah 29:13, which says, learn commandments of men. Others translate this, learn commandments of men learned by rote. In the Hebrew Matthew, there's the exact quote from Isaiah word for word. Learn commandments of men. Now that's very interesting. If Hebrew Matthew is supposedly this translation from Greek, wouldn't it have the Hebrew equivalent of teaching for doctrine of the commandments of men rather than the exact precise words of Isaiah? That's a very, very interesting. Yeshua goes on. He warns against the Takanot of the Pharisees. He also warns against their precedents, not to do their precedents. And the Hebrew word for precedents is ma'asim. Ma'asim is a word we'll look at in a moment. But these are two really important words, Takanot and ma'asim, because these are the two things that if you're disciples of Yeshua, that he's warning you not to do, the Takanot and ma'asim. So let's all say those words together. Takanot and ma'asim. All right, so what are these ma'asim? Ma'asim are precedents. The literal meaning is actions or deeds, and the Greek it translates this as ergon, which in your English you have works, the works of the Pharisees. But what are the works of the actions or deeds of the Pharisees? In Pharisee terminology, ma'asim refers to precedents or acts or deeds that serve as precedents. And what do they mean by that? Well, we've already seen that Pharisee law needs to legislate every aspect of life, literally from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to sleep at night. And what is, for example, the Pharisees command their disciples which shoe to put on first in the morning. So what does a Pharisee do when he comes to a new situation where the oral law doesn't tell him what to do? For example, if he lives in a country where you don't have shoelaces, and he doesn't know which shoe to put on first in the morning because he doesn't know which one to tie first because there are no laces. So what he does is he combs the oral law looking for instruction, and he combs tradition and man-made laws, and if he can't find any instruction on which shoe to put on first in the morning, if there are no laces, then he goes and he looks at the precedents of one of his rabbis. Meaning he looks and he says, we know that such and such a rabbi on such and such an occasion put on his right shoe first even though he didn't have laces, and that becomes a precedent. That then establishes what the proper norm, the proper standard of behavior is. The assumption is this rabbi could not be sinning, and if he put on his right shoe first, even though he didn't have laces, that's the proper standard for behavior. And what Yeshua is saying is, don't look to the precedents of the Pharisees as the proper standard of behavior. Don't do according to their precedents. Do as Moses says, not according to their takanot and their ma'asim. Let's look quickly at an example of a precedent. This is a precedent brought in the Talmud, and it says a ma'aseh. Ma'aseh is singular for ma'asim, so a precedent. A precedent which Rabban Gamliel, you probably thought it was pronounced Gamaliel. The correct Hebrew pronunciation is Gamliel. And Gamliel, as you all know, was the Pharisaical teacher of Shaul of Tarsus, of Paul. However, this is Gamliel's grandson, Gamliel II. So a precedent which Rabban Gamliel II and the elders were traveling in a ship when a Gentile made a ramp on which to descend, and Rabban Gamliel and the elders descended by it. Okay, so what on earth is this talking about? The Pharisees start off with the principle that if somebody builds something for you on the Sabbath, you may not use that. If they build a ramp for you on the Sabbath, you may not use that ramp. And so then they ask the question, what if the ramp is built on the Sabbath, but it's not specifically for me? May I use that ramp? And the oral law doesn't tell them what to do. So they go and they say, okay, we remember that one time Rabban Gamliel II descended on such a ramp, and that tells us that this was the proper behavior, and that such a thing is permissible. In other words, the behavior of the rabbi in a specific circumstance becomes the standard by which one should behave by in the future. And what Yeshua is warning his disciples is, don't do according to their takanot, and don't do according to their ma'asim. Their claim to authority is that they sit in the seat of Moses, so do as he says. Do as Moses says. Now, what we've seen up until now is that the words of Yeshua in the Greek, what we may venture to call the Greek Jesus, because that's what he's called in Greek, Jesus, Jesus. The Greek Jesus, he's coming and he's changing Torah, adding to Torah, taking away. He's saying, oh, don't worry about not adding to the Torah. Do whatever the Pharisees tell you to do. If they tell you what shoe to put on first in the morning, put on that right shoe first. Even though that contradicts what he said 8 chapters earlier in Matthew 15. Now, we've seen now, on the other hand, the Hebrew Yeshua is actually telling people, do as Moses says. Their claim to authority is they sit in the seat of Moses, do as he says, do as Moses says. So the Hebrew Yeshua is actually, or Yeshua's words, as he's portrayed in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, is actually upholding Torah. Now, what about this statement, because they talk but they do not do? When I first read this, my question was, what do they talk and what don't they do? When we read this in the Greek, it's very clear that it's saying they're hypocrites. But now in the Hebrew, we have a whole new context. He's not saying to obey the Pharisees, even though they don't do what they do themselves, what they say themselves. He's saying obey Moses. So what's this they talk and they do not do? What are they talking and what aren't they doing? And when I first read this, I really wasn't sure what the answer was. I wasn't so clear. And the answer came to me in a very roundabout way. I'd received an email a number of years back from someone who was confusing Karaites and Samaritans. I mentioned to you that Karaites are strictly Old Testament Tanakh Jews. Samaritans, of course, you know from the New Testament, are the people in Samaria who worship on Mount Gerizim. Let's get a quick rundown of the difference. Karaites, of course, believe in the entire Tanakh, the Old Testament, whereas Samaritans believe only in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, and their Torah is actually different than the Torah used by all the other Jews. In the Torah of the Samaritans, it commands them to worship on the high place on Mount Gerizim, which is a mountain just outside of Nablus, of Shechem, and whereas the Karaites worship at Jerusalem and turn to Jerusalem in prayer, like King Solomon talks about in 1 Kings 8. Of course, Karaites are Israelites or Jews, whereas Samaritans are Babylonians who were forcibly settled in the land of Israel by the Assyrian kings after the 10 northern tribes were exiled from Israel. And the story of the Samaritans is really given in 2 Kings chapter 17, where it talks about how the 10 tribes were exiled from Israel, and the king of Assyria didn't want this to be an empty land, so he brought in these people from Kuthia, from Babylon, and settled them into the land of Israel, into the northern part of Israel. And it talks about how when they first settled in the land, they were attacked by a plague of lions. And they said, why are we being attacked by lions? It must be because we're not worshiping the local God. So they went to the king of Assyria and said, can you please give us a priest that will teach us how to worship the local God, who of course in this case is the God of Israel. So who does the king of Assyria send them? He sends them one of the priests from the 10 northern tribes. This is one of the priests that had gotten the 10 northern tribes exiled in the first place. And what he teaches them is the ways of the 10 northern tribes that had gotten them exiled. And he brings with him the Torah, but he also at the same time teaches them to do according to the ways of these 10 tribes, worshiping at the high places, sacrificing outside of the temple in Jerusalem, on Mount Gerizim and other places. And then in 2 Kings 17, verse 34, it summarizes the ways of the Samaritans, and it says, until this very day they do according to their former ways, according to their statutes and their judgments. This is how it reads in the Hebrew. They do not fear Yehovah, and they do not do. And then in the Hebrew, the words they do not do is isolated in such a way that it emphasizes those words. And then it completes the sentence and says, according to the Torah and commandments that Yehovah commanded the children of Jacob. So what don't the Samaritans do? They don't do according to the Torah. Now, after I'd read Matthew 23 and then I reread this passage, I realized in Hebrew this sounds very similar. There's a similar style here. And it seemed to me that Yeshua was echoing the words of 2 Kings 17:34 about the Samaritans. And I think what he was saying is that just as the Samaritans of old do according to their statutes and their judgments, and they do not do according to the Torah, so too the Pharisees of his own era do according to their Takanot and their Ma'asim, their reforms and their precedents, and they talk Torah, but they don't do Torah. And what does he mean they talk Torah? They're sitting in the seat of Moses, talking Torah to you all day long, but what they're really telling you is not Torah. It's just in the guise of Torah. What they're really telling you are their own reforms and precedents, and they don't really do Torah.